Hello, let's look at chapter 3 of internal auditing. This chapter is about governance. Page 3-1. You know, we start talking about governance. I always think of shared governance. That was a term that was used in my doctorate program that within a university, the shared governance that goes on between various departments, and really from an operational standpoint of taking the guidance from the top to your policy level down to your procedural level. So when we look there on the bottom page 3-1, it does talk here about the actual organizational structure will vary from organization to organization. So whether you're talking about higher education, or if you're talking about a corporation or a nonprofit, both of which I've been familiar with, the overall governance is about stakeholder needs are met, whoever those are. We'll talk about who the various stakeholders are in a company. But governance, if you look at 3-2, and they have a pretty good chart there that talks about or shows the really relationship between this overall umbrella that you're going to see later on in this chapter as well, this overall umbrella of governance. But here they're showing it more circular, that within the governance, we have what's called risk management. And then, of course, the bullseye there is internal control, and how the communication there from the top down, from the governance to risk management to internal control and back up through the chain. And then what's depicted here is so important. And the very last thing in this chapter is going to take the same diagram and show how internal audit is responsible for ensuring what goes on in each of those three areas. But this governance surrounds really all activities in an organization by complying with laws, regulations, in a lot of areas, EPA, OSHA, TOSHA, of course, the financial regulations that we have as well, which there's a good list of those at the back, including Dodd-Frank and, of course, Sarbanes-Oxley, the most recent ones. Risk management is the next layer in the governance structure. Identifying the risk that may adversely affect. And it's a tough job of trying to do your risk assessment without being not overbearing, but too much, of having too much when it comes to trying to do too many things with assurance. But we should exploit the opportunities that enable success as well. So it's obviously about identifying the risk and also helping the profitability of your company. And of course, then the center part of this, internal control, the center part of this exhibit is a key part of this overall depiction of key governance elements. Again, looking on page 3-3, and I don't need to read this to you since you're reading it for yourselves in order to answer these multiple choice questions on each chapter, as well as the case study. Here we've got the definition of what governance is. It says it's the corporate governance is a set of relationships between a company's management, its board, and its shareholders, right? Your board, its management, senior management, stakeholders. Of course, senior management is a part of who's going to make the corporate governance happen through what's talked about on the next couple of pages. But again, shared governance is a very important topic here. If we look at 3-4, page 3-4, again, there is showing this governance as an umbrella with a board of directors who are maintaining strategic direction, right? Your 3 to 5 year plan or longer. And of course, your governance oversight. You know, within the board of directors, oftentimes you might have committees, a risk committee and so forth. I know the last company I did some work for here in Johnson City, a relatively small nonprofit, about $7 million a year in revenue. They had a board of directors made up of about 24 or 25 different folks that were really political figures. They were mayors of all of the cities, towns, and counties of the 8 counties of Northeast Tennessee. And so that's about 25 different people. But the only committee they had while I was there, just a short time, about 3 years, was a finance committee who were really more about looking into the details of driving a positive culture within the organization, because the financial side of things is really taking everything into consideration operationally. And this finance committee was responsible for trying to find solutions to potential findings that we would have from our audit that went on every year. And usually the findings were minor, but there were things to improve upon. There were never any material weaknesses, but a finance committee would be a part of the governance within a board of directors. And the board of directors are the ones that would approve any type of budget, annual budget that we had, pay increases for the staff, and other things that might come up relative to the company. And finance is always a key part of that. That's why accounting, finance, call it finance committee, it's really accounting committee, but finance is sort of all inclusive of anything that has to do with a dollar sign. But it's really more of an accounting committee, but it's called finance. And that's why accounting is such a foundational discipline, which you're in a master's program here, and excellent choice for that. Then on 3-5, what we see there is key components of governance oversight. They've got this word stakeholders. That's usually a management term that is thrown around quite a bit. The stakeholders, who can be a variety of entities, employees, vendors, or suppliers, and we'll get into that. Senior management, governmental agencies. But what we see there is governance umbrella, board of directors. We have risk management between senior management and the risk owners. And then at the same time, we've got assurance, which used to be called audit. Now it's called assurance for internal audit. We've got external audits as well, working not together, but oftentimes they're working on the same things, just separate entities. And then they go into the roles and responsibilities there on the bottom of page 3-5. There on page 3-6, it goes into who are the stakeholders, right? Employees. You obviously have a stake. You're a stakeholder in what goes on. Me as an employee of ETSU, I'm a stakeholder in ETSU. Very important that obviously we continue to be successful and in order to pay salaries, right? Nobody comes to work unless they're paid salaries. So they're directly involved in the conduct of the organization's business and the success. Customers, what a key stakeholder. If they're not consider you a viable company, if you don't make a quality product or deliver a quality service, then you're not going to have many customers. Students aren't going to come to ETSU unless we have that accreditation. We have a cost competitive tuition for students, but they want a job when you want a job when you get out. And it should be based on us having a quality program here and quality delivery at an affordable price. Vendors as well, vendors to our college or a company. They want you to be successful and not going to ship you shoddy material because it's going to be rejected. And if you're not getting quality from that supplier, you're going to find someone else. So vendors, suppliers, which is a sort of used simultaneously, synonymous. Vendor, suppliers are the same. Shareholders, investors. Talking about a company, earnings per share. Common shareholders own the company. So as earnings per share goes up, stock price will go up because the PE multiple goes down. University, higher education is not really relevant. The investors there are people who are donating to the endowment or donating to further improve the education that we offer here. And so that will dry up if alumni or other benefactors believe that we're not sticking to our mission that is published. Regulatory agencies. The SEC obviously is a big one for publicly traded companies, right? Enforcing GAAP. What about Department of Labor? I've dealt with the Department of Labor. They got the EPA listed, top of page 3-7. EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, that's federal. And of course, in Tennessee, it's TOSHA, Tennessee, OSHA. All of those are really involved in your company, your plant, or wherever they might be, that you're following all of the regulations, guidelines. Department of Labor, are you paying overtime to folks that work more than 40 hours in a week? Are you paying people for time worked? We've always had some employee that might go to the Department of Labor and complain that they were working off the clock. I remember that's the last issue we had. An employee said they were working off the clock as an hourly employee, not being paid for it. And so the Department of Labor auditor came in to interview people. Not unusual. Of course, EPA is also, and OSHA are always, especially manufacturing, really in your stuff, trying to figure out if you're offering a safe environment for your employees and not emitting more than the limits of toxic materials into the atmosphere. I was at Nuclear Fuel Services in Irwin first 11 years of my career. And there you had the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC, and it was the Department of Energy of the U.S. government who did the contracting for the fuel that we made there. And so those are agencies that are generated by the government to protect employees and to protect the financials. We had auditors there from DCAS, I believe is what it is, or DCAA, Defense Contract Auditing Agency. They probably call it Assurance Agency now, to make sure our books are right and we're charging just what was agreed to in the contract. So those are all regulatory agencies, they're all stakeholders. So you're not just operating in a vacuum, you and your management and your employees in a company, you've got a lot of stakeholders. Then you got financial institutions, 3-7. But all this is shedding light on how important it is to have good internal governance and shared governance. It's not talked here, but shared governance. Governance, I have trouble saying that word, governance. Important to the internal audit functions. If you look on 3-8, he goes into detail here and specifically talking about the following types of outcomes for and expectations from the various stakeholders: financial, compliance, operations, strategic, like a list of things there. Again, you can read this. This chapter is more foundational. Senior management on page 3-9. And they start out there with a great, terrific sentence. Although the board provides the umbrella of governance oversight, management executes the day-to-day activities that help ensure effective governance is achieved. It's important. Governance is implemented and monitored by your management, right? Between management and your operating folks. Establishing a risk committee, articulating reporting requirements on page 3-10. Risk owners, here is really talking about referencing to individuals who conduct day-to-day activities to manage risk. Who's controlling cash that's received for revenue if you're in a small company? If some of it's coming in through ACH or some of it's through checks, what if it's coming in cash? What are your internal control narratives? How are these procedures at that level, these narratives driving through internal governance, right? Or shared governance up here at the policy level that's been established? That's one of the first things external auditors look at. And of course, if external auditing is looking at it, internal audit is to make sure you have defined your procedures or your policies and then your procedures of governance. But it's at this day-to-day activities that these risk owners, they're the ones that are going to be held accountable. Sure, it's going to bubble up to the top that they're accountable for, but they want to make sure they're hiring competent, qualified people, right? Which is a part of it. But these risk owners, that they're adequately managing the risk to tolerance levels. You don't want something that is burdensome. That was the term I was looking for a minute ago. Burdensome, that it takes so much time, it gets very little return for that. There's a law of diminishing returns on what you're doing there with tolerance levels. It's like signing checks. Sometimes companies have policies that, well, it only takes one signature if the check's less than $50 or $500, depending on the company size. And checks over that amount have to have 2 signatures. Or some companies just say, we want all checks signed by 2 people. That's what we did at that company I was just telling you about. They had 48 people and $7 million a year, 2 board members. board members had to sign every check. And of course, you had separate people doing the purchasing and buying, inventory receipt, bill of lading, someone else actually generating the check and looking over it before it was signed, someone else doing the bank recon, a lot of segregation of functions. But all of these are managing risk and something to be considered. Also there in 3-11, assessing the ongoing capabilities of the organization. Evaluating the maturity of the procedures. How long have these procedures been in place? Have they been modified on a regular basis? That's where you want to revise data on, and maybe what revision number to show they're constantly being looked at, because that's one of the first things audit wants to look at, internal or external. Are you doing what you say you're doing? And that, I've seen that in manufacturing and huge corporations where it has really nothing directly related to financial, but when you're doing an audit of ISO 9000 or TS 16949, which is required for the big three American auto manufacturers, they wanted to see your documentation, and then they would go out on the floor and talk to the people and see the procedures that you have for these policies. The procedures are in place and being followed. And when they go out and start talking to people on the floor, that's where it gets scary, when they go up to someone and say, I didn't know that procedure was there. I mean, that doesn't happen, but because usually they're coached about that before the audit took place. But these audits went on usually twice a year to retain that certification in order to do business with those particular manufacturers. Well, the same applies to accounting and the financial side as well. Maybe not audited every 6 months, even once a year. But all of this is, we're talking about big picture, this umbrella here, the maturity of the procedures in place and the competence and experience of the people performing those procedures, right? They want to know stuff about your retention. How much turnover is there? How much training goes on? Where's your training records for this? What's the competence of the people you're hiring, especially in accounting and finance? Are you hiring degreed accountants to do accounting work, or are you hiring someone that maybe isn't as qualified or shouldn't be in that position? So they look at job descriptions, right? Position descriptions. What are the minimum requirements for the job? HR is usually big on that because they need to have these set of job descriptions across all disciplines and show that you're following these procedures to satisfy that you're being fair and equitable in your hiring, right? The next bullet point there on 311, risk management activities are currently operating as designed. Again, kind of like what I've already said, very important to do what you say you're doing. They're going to check to see that you're doing that. 3-12, assurance activities. Internal audit function, promoting appropriate ethics and values within the company. Performance management, budgets, variance analysis. Are you analyzing what your variances are? All these are, I'm kind of getting down the weeds on this, but trying to tell you some of the things that go on that are important to internal and external audit. Then they talk about one of the standards there, bottom of page 3-12, standard 2120 risk management states, internal audit must evaluate the effectiveness and contribute to the improvement of risk management processes. All right, there's 3 lines of defense model there on top of page 314. First line of defense are these management controls, internal control measures. What's the second line? Reporting up to senior management. Financial controller, that's all we're all concerned about, right? Now, some of you had me in the controllership class last semester. Responsibilities of corporate controller, plant controller, divisional controller is a little bit different for each of them, but especially when you're talking about a financial controller and they're talking about compliance, health and safety, environment, it sounds like they're talking about a lot of different disciplines that you might find in a plant environment. Obviously, that second line of defense with the financial controller, you know, you look at most organizational structures, the financial controller may report to a general manager, someone who is over that division or that location. But that controller oftentimes, well, most of the time, is going to have a dotted line to someone at another location, physically separated, that is a divisional controller. Someone in the finance function goes up through the corporate controllership and CFO, because it's so important that that financial controller, that plant controller, division controller, operational controller has some accountability to someone. And a lot of times that dotted line is more of a solid line, depending on the company, especially in a situation where maybe some stuff is going on that shouldn't be, and the controller has to go up through that dotted line to get their point across of some things that are going on, because I've seen that happen. I've had it happen to me. Whereas the general manager in that location, that division, may not want to do the right thing. I know you looked at that case last week. In chapter 2, there's a good case there, which I gave you a little bit of information to look into and give you a starting point. You can see that non-financial people oftentimes don't want to do the right thing. Some of it is based on ignorance, and some of it is based on, well, they tend to keep their job or profit from the fact that they can shove something under the carpet or accrue revenue that shouldn't be accrued, or whatever it might be, or not book bad debt expense when they should, based on the accrual base of accounting. And of course, the inventory as well, not writing stuff off that should be written off. But that's where the financial control, that second line of defense, that's where you have to be the one, you, me, accounting types, we have to be the one stand up for what we know is right based on these various legislative bodies have promulgated, that we'll read here at the very end, that appendix, Sarbanes-Oxley and Dodd-Frank, stuff like that. Very important that somebody stands up for what's right. But I know when I was at Exide, that dotted line was really a dotted line. And sometimes I wonder if it was almost an imaginary line up to the corporate office, because they talked all about you work for the plant manager. Well, when I went there 19 years, it seems to vary between, probably more so pre Sarbanes-Oxley, when that dotted line was sort of hazy. But after that, that dotted line was more apparent, and sometimes a solid line. At least I know it was solid line in 2004 and 2005. But when I was at Lear, of course, that was in 2013. That dotted line to the corporate office in Detroit, that was really a solid line from the controller to the finance function all the way to the top. And even though I've reported administratively to the plant manager, and you just got to feel, and I wasn't there but 3 months, got to feel that I worked for the corporate office and the finance function as opposed to the plant manager. I was the highest paid person on staff, which is very unusual. You wouldn't have had that at Exide. I was, out of 8 or 9 people that worked for the plant manager, I was probably halfway down the chart, probably paid 4th or 5th. Yeah, but at Lear, and the controller before me, a lady who was in that job, she was the highest paid. I was the highest paid person. I was paid more than the production manager, quality manager, HR, materials manager. I was the highest paid person there because it was that important. The finances, it's that important. And that's because Lear was a well-run company, $14 billion company, made about $1 billion a year. Where they are now, you look it up, LEA, you see how well they've done making automotive seats. The Exide was not like, they were very weak, financially weak company, and never made any money. It was run by production types that you get what you put into that top senior management position. Of course, board of directors probably was below par board of directors driving this. And I could go off on a lot of different things in that area, but that's the second line of defense, the financial control. You have to stand up for what is right. You know what is right. If you're not sure, that tells you you're probably you do know what's right and what's wrong. And then the third line of defense is internal audit. Because we had that at Exide, we had that at Lear. Internal audit was always there. Usually trying to stay a step ahead of external audit. They don't really tell you that, but internal audit did try to stay a step ahead of external audit. And internal audit wants to do the right thing, even at Exide, through all those years. And at Lear, I know when I was at Lear, I was only there 3 months, but the internal audit guy was coming in to see me, and came to see me just a couple weeks before I left, in preparation for the external audit that was coming up. So he was wanting to make sure that all our T's were crossed and I's were dotted in our procedures, that we're doing what we say we're doing, right? But publicly traded companies really are driven based on these procedures. You got to make sure you got to get internal audit department. Well, governance has evolved. You see that on page 3-15. I will make one more point. I've got highlighted up here in the second paragraph on 315 about redundant and unnecessary assurance activities. Well, some of those, Kim, you do need to streamline these processes. I mean, if you don't, you get into areas where things like ghost ticking go on, or phantom ticking, where people will tick that they've done things and they really haven't, which is unethical, first of all. But driving down at the root causes why that has happened. Are people overworked, or are there things being done that really aren't adding value? Or if you didn't do it, is it material, right? Materiality to the overall risk assessment. So I just want to point that out before we look at 3-16. And here we see the evolution of, and the various legislation that has gone on since the crash of 1929. Securities Act of 33 and 34. You know, the market crashed in 29. But a lot of people don't know it didn't actually, market didn't bottom until 3 years later, 1932. I mean, it was a slow bleed down after that huge drop in 1929 before it bounced back and then a bleed off. We've seen that in our economy, or our stock market here back in 2000, when it started down and bottomed like 3 times before it finally bottomed in 2002, and somewhat in 2000, from 2008 to 2009. But here, it's interesting, whenever you have these big declines in the stock market, politicians get involved, right? They did in 1933 and 34. And then in 1977, here we had the aftermath of the Watergate investigation with Nixon and the spying that went on and the lying as well. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, you just have to go through that online seminar every year at Exide, which was a big deal. Your publicly traded company. Very specific there about not getting involved in doing stuff that appears to be bribes and so forth, which a lot of stuff like that's considered okay in foreign countries, but it's not in this country. And even though you're doing business with foreign countries, you're an American citizen, an American corporation, you're accountable for that personally, not just your company. So if you ever work for a publicly traded company in this country, you're going to encounter that. 1987 Treadway Commission report about inaccurate, incomplete, misleading reporting. 1991 FDIC, you know, there used to be savings and loans and banks. You had FSLIC, which is now gone, which accounts for protected up to $100,000 in a savings and loan, but now they've all been rolled into the FDIC for, I think, $250,000 now per account. Credit unions are separate, although they're covered as well, similar to a bank. That all came about in the late 80s, early 90s. You had some savings and loans that failed. Then the one that you've probably been reading about and had in the undergrad classes is the Sarbanes-Oxley Act 2002, which amended 1933 and 34. Big deal, huge changes there because of Enron, WorldCom, Adelphia, Global Crossing. A lot of stuff went on back in the late 1990s, especially the early 2000s. Enron, the biggest of all of those, since it was the most widely held stock, I believe, at that time. I think Lucent was pretty close to them as well. But even at the plant level, operationally, that was driven all the way down to the plant level and things that you had to monitor and sign as the site financial manager along with the plant manager or general manager. What had to be signed off on every 3 months that you're doing all these various things. We'll probably get into that later on in this book. And so that brings us up to what went on in, of course, that 2002. Again, the market topped in 2000 with the build out for Y2K. And then it started just a slow bleed down before it finally bottomed in, I think the S&P was like 1550 in 2000, like March and September of 2000, kind of like a double top. Markets do that a lot of times, a double top, and then it just started a slow bleed down. And then it had some pretty violent swings, but it bottomed in somewhat July of 2002, and then again in October 2002, almost like a double bottom. Somewhat bottomed again in March of 2003 when the Iraq war started, but not as low as those other two bottoms. So that usually goes on as well when you have a true market decline, which we haven't had since 2009. So that brings us up here to 2010 of Dodd-Frank. And again, that was after the debacle we had in 2008, which had the huge housing bubble at that time, where people were putting zero down and prices were going out of sight. Of course, they're going out of sight now, but people aren't putting zero down, I don't think. But, you know, you had Smith Barney, I believe, went out of business, Bear Stearns, sort of like the government picked and chose who they wanted to save and who they didn't save. And it was a scary time back in 2008, September 2008, with what happened financially to this country. But that's where they came out with this Dodd-Frank Wall Street reform, because of this financial crisis in late 2007, and really came to fruition big time in August and September 2008. But again, the market didn't bottom. I still remember the market bottomed March 9th of 2009. The S&P 500 was 667, and now today it's like 4,100. But you know, I told you the market was like 1550 back in March and August, September 2000. It's 1550. It fell all the way, I think, to like 750 by 2002, but it went all the way back up to its previous highs, about 1550 again, very close to where it was in 2000. 7 years later, it came back to its highs. Then it went from 1550 all the way down to 667 in March of 2009. Now it's gone up pretty much every year. Really haven't had a bad year. And so now we're sitting at really all-time highs from a price earnings ratio as well. But those are some of the legislation. It usually comes after huge stock market declines, because that's what this country is all about. It's the stock market and keeping returns up, making the rich people richer and people invest in stocks, right? Of course, everybody has skin in the game from your retirements and so forth, but all right, so that brings us to 3-18. And here, again, they've got the same diagram, but this time they put internal audit in there, right? And the role that it plays. They do a good job there on 319, 320, 321. They list each of these Securities Acts, what we just went over, especially Sarbanes-Oxley, Section 404, effectiveness of internal control and financial reporting. You're going to encounter that, I guarantee you, in your career, even if you don't work in public accounting. It says this section in particular requires most companies to improve the documentation and testing around those internal controls to support the required assertions. All right, and then the latest one, Dodd-Frank, there on 321. All right, so now you have an assignment, the multiple choice questions, and then case one, I believe, 4, chapter 3. I'll tell you the wrong thing. It's in your syllabus. Case 1 and all multiple choice questions. So case 1, it's not as good as case as what we had in chapter 2, but you can read there, review the governance regulations for Australia, South Africa, and the United Kingdom. Conduct additional research on the internet to answer the following questions. What events have been the impetus for each of these countries promulgating these regulations? Describe the ways in which these regulations are similar. Describe at least one notable difference between each of these regulations. Which of these regulations do you believe has the most comprehensive governance requirements and why? And where does the United States stand in regards to the others? When you answer that case 1, like you did in the last one, it needs to be at least 1,000 words, right? Not pages, 1,000 words. And you just type that out as well in Word and then submit that. Obviously, the multiple choice questions are pretty easy to answer, right? And at some point when you have the exam, I'm just going to select some of the multiple choice questions there for you to answer. But do a good job on the write-up there on this, and we'll look at chapter 4 next time. Hope you have a good day.